Cash had thought long and hard about leaving the club, but never got around to doing it. Whether it was his love for his brothers, his fear of boxers' reprisal, or a natural attachment to the $5,000 Sinopoli owed him, Krikrias must have spent the final minutes of his life thinking that leaving would have been immeasurably better than staying in the no surrender crew, no matter the consequences. The bikers in the barn waited for the sound of a car starting up to take Crash to the hospital, as Celestine had promised. Instead, from the darkness outside came a now familiar hollow sound. Pop, 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 pop. Pony Gisson might have known what was coming next when he was summoned to follow the gunman. A radio inside the barn cracked out loud music now, but it had still been possible for Pony to hear the staccato of bullets outside. "Let's go, Celestine. Let's go," Celestine said, then walked towards the door. Pony fell in behind, followed by MH. It would have been easy for any of the conspirators to shoot Celestine in the back and put an end to the slaughter, but somehow the hillbilly biker knew this wasn't going to happen, as he turned his back on them yet again to lead Pony to the back seat of his own tow truck. Pony must have wondered how he had come to meet such a fate. In his time in the club, he hadn't raised his voice to anyone or touched anything that wasn't his. He had worked hard at an honest job and hadn't ratted on anybody. All he seemed to want from life was a cold beer, a little coke, and some friends around him as he lived out his final days before his cancer claimed him. As Pony climbed into his truck, Celestine shot him point blank in the head. Then he slipped the barrel of the rifle under Pony's shirt and another shot tore into his chest as Celestine made sure he was dead. Since Ripper Fullinger's cancer was discovered, Pony had spent at least an hour a day comforting his dying biker brother. Now, Ripper had outlived him. In the past, Pony had shocked his family back in the Maritimes when he had told them his stories of violence in Ontario. They never knew whether he was exaggerating when he talked about crime in the big city. Now, Pony himself was a murder statistic. Anything more than 3 murders at a time is considered by police to be a mass murder. Celestine's crew had already killed 4 men they called brothers. 4 members of the No Surrender crew were still alive, and there were a few more hours of darkness before the sun came up again. What happened next was bizarre, even by Wiener Celestine's standards. He began to boast to no one in particular about his work ethic. The murders had already become more of a chore than a drama. His lifeless brothers were just a problem to clean up, a task he attacked with grim, heartless industriousness. And so Celestine stood proudly in the midst of the slaughter of his biker brothers and bragged about how much effort he was putting into killing them. It was as if he expected praise for the job, like a little schoolchild who cleans blackboards for his teacher. MH was no stranger to the rougher side of life, but he sounded stunned as he later recalled Celestine's mood. He was complaining about having to do all the wet work, MH said, that none of these other fucking guys do that. At one point, after a huddle outside with Celestine and Sandham, Mushy walked close to MH and whispered to him, "Be ready." Goldberg Flans was talking to Taz Sandham about his children and smoking a cigarette Taz had apparently handed him. Celestine had been downing beer throughout the night and interrupted to order Flans to put his cigarette into an empty. Around this time, Celestine turned to Bam Bam Salerno and called him a fucking goof and kicked him squarely in the head. Again, no one lifted a hand or uttered a word to stop him. Salerno and Big Paul Sinopoli were sitting on the white plastic chairs inside the barn when Celestine ordered Big Paul to follow him and Arvina outside. The massive biker obeyed meekly. His breathing was labored at the best of times, and his fears of his impending death only made it worse. Arvina later recalled that Big Paul looked afraid, and he tried to comfort him, saying, "Don't worry, you're going home." Big Paul didn't react at all, as if he didn't hear the words. MH pulled Flan's Infinity closer to the barn and opened its rear hatch. Wiener ordered Sinopoli to lay down in the back, and he complied, perhaps having convinced himself that the madman was actually taking him to the hospital, as he had promised. Seconds after Big Paul had arranged his bulk in the back of the SUV, there was the sickeningly familiar soft sound, pop. The hatchback was flapping, and Big Paul was somehow still alive. Celestine was enraged, since his rifle had jammed, slowing down his murder. "Piece of shit gun," he barked, then pulled a handgun out of his coat and leveled it on Big Paul. "Shut up and die like a man," he commanded. Pop, pop. Arvina later said that Celestine then ordered him into the front seat of the Infinity, but he refused, saying, "Fuck no," before fleeing into the farmhouse. Each trip back into the barn for a fresh victim seemed to excite Celestine more, as though he was soaring on a second wind. He danced his strange little jig, brandishing his rifle and pistol, caroling his own little personal hymn to Nazism. When his musical interlude ended, Celestine gestured for Salerno to follow him and Mushy outside. Before he did, Bam Bam did something shocking and totally unexpected, as if the final moments of his life called for a defining gesture to his biker brothers. He tried to shake hands, MH later said, with what seemed like disbelief in his voice. "I never did," Dwight did. "I never did," Dwight did. He asked Wayne to take care of his kid. MH later said he couldn't shake Bam Bam's hand because he liked him. Perhaps MH had to distance himself emotionally from the man who was about to become Celestine's next victim. Perhaps a gesture of friendship was too much of a lie, even for that night. Bam Bam also reached for Arvina's hand, but the Winnipegger refused, saying, "I'm not shaking your hand." Arvina would later claim that he didn't know Bam Bam was about to die when he balked at making contact with his bleeding, outstretched hand. "I didn't even know the guy," Arvina said. "I thought everyone was going home that night. Why would I want to ruin my clothes?" "Make sure you guys tell my family where my body is," Bam Bam said as he was led out into the darkness. Once again, from outside the barn came the soft, horrible sound. Pop, 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 pop. Little Mikey Trotta and Goldberg Flans remained inside the barn, still cleaning blood from the floor when Celestine returned. Flans talked quickly and nervously about his two preschool children, Hunter and Amanda, and asked for another cigarette. Taz Sandham handed him one and listened to the young father talk about his love for his family. Wiener Celestine produced a jug of acid and interrupted Flans as he ordered everyone not to touch it. Only he would handle the black jug, and when he did so, he would wear gloves and a special breathing mask. MH couldn't help thinking that it looked like the kind of bottle that genies pop out of in television cartoons. Now it was little Mikey's turn to walk into the darkness. True to his promise, Celestine was making the Jew Flans wait the longest so that he would suffer the most. When they got to the Infinity, little Mikey would have had to contemplate the bodies of Big Paul Sinopoli and Bam Bam Salerno before he joined them in death. Pop, pop. Finally, it was time for Goldberg Flans. Celestine mentioned for him to follow. There was no one left inside the barn to guard, so Frank Mather, Marcelo Arvina, and MH wandered out into the starless night. Bill Gardner pushed the scattered baby toys on the back seat of Trotta's Grand Prix out of the way to make room for Flans, who had stopped talking about how much he loved his young children. When Flans had squeezed his imposing frame into the cramped back seat, Taz Sandham, who also had two young children, reached in, gripping the high-point pistol. There was still time for Sandham to snatch something redeeming from that hellish night in his often pathetic life. The little man, who had always wanted to be a hero, had the power to turn the gun on the killers and perhaps free Jamie Flans. It would not have made up for the other 7 killings that night, but with that one act, Sandham would finally have done something approaching the heroic. "You guys walk away," Sandham ordered to his co-conspirators. MH later said he turned his head away in an instant before the loud bang and the flash of a muzzle. Somehow, as the silence and darkness closed back in, Flans was still alive. Taz had shot him point blank in the cheek, but had only managed to wound his victim gruesomely. For the moment, at least, Flans was still breathing. Had Taz Sandham been a smarter or braver man, he would have kept quiet at this point. The others would have surely believed that Flans was dead. How could Sandham, who had bragged he was a trained sniper, miss with an up-close shot to the head? But he was boiling with fear and remorse, and mumbled something about the pistol jamming as he lurched toward the farmhouse. The gun was in his right hand, as he seemed to be trying to unjam it with his left hand, as he muttered to himself about Goldberg's young children. Dwight Mushy took the gun from Taz's hand and walked into the farmhouse with him. Moments later, he returned and climbed into the Grand Prix, pressing the barrel hard between Flans's eyes. Flans's eyes bulged, and it looked as though he was trying to mutter some last words, but he was interrupted by the morning's final muzzle flash.